April 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but not yet over. The sky above Bavaria hung heavy with the smoke of a dying Reich, and every road seemed to lead to surrender. American soldiers, exhausted and hollow-eyed, were pushing deeper into German territory, expecting ambushes, snipers, and the scattered resistance of men who refused to admit defeat. But on one forgotten afternoon, a reconnaissance patrol turned down a dirt road toward what intelligence called a small containment site. No one expected what they would find there. It wasn't the sound of gunfire that reached them first. It was music. A violin's trembling cry floated over the pine trees, followed by the deep, haunting resonance of a cello. Then, a flute, tentative but clear, like a bird testing the air after a storm. The soldiers froze, fingers on triggers. Music. Here. They moved cautiously, boots crunching on gravel, until the camp came into view. Barbed wire, watchtowers, rows of barracks. A prisoner of war camp. But instead of chaos or silence, the courtyard was filled with rows of German soldiers, playing instruments. Their uniforms were faded, their faces pale, but their hands moved with grace and precision. Some played violins made from scavenged parts, others beat on makeshift drums carved from crates. And there, at the center, stood a man in a torn officer's coat, conducting them as if he were standing before the Berlin Philharmonic instead of a camp surrounded by wire and war. The Americans lowered their weapons. The music swelled. For a few moments, in the last days of a world gone mad, there was peace, born not of treaties, but of trembling strings and human hands. The soldiers didn't know whether to weep, laugh, or stand in silence. What they had stumbled upon was more than a performance. It was a defiance of despair, a symphony against oblivion. To understand what those American troops witnessed that day, we have to step back to the final, chaotic year of the Second World War. By 1944, Germany's military machine was crumbling. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east. Bombs fell daily on cities that once echoed with parades and speeches. Berlin's orchestras, once symbols of the Reich's cultural pride, now played in dim shelters or not at all. Music, like everything else, was consumed by war. In those desperate months, the German army established hundreds of Kriegsgefangenenlager, prisoner of war camps, scattered across occupied Europe and Germany itself. These were not death camps. They were places where captured soldiers, both Allied and Axis, waited out the war under harsh but regulated conditions. Food was scarce, medicine scarcer, and morale non-existent. Among those captured were not just fighters, but also musicians. Men pulled from conservatories, orchestras, and opera houses, forced into uniforms, and then into captivity. Violinists who had once performed in Vienna now shared bunks with infantrymen. A cellist from Dresden found himself playing for rations in a barack full of strangers. One of these camps, deep in southern Germany, was officially known as Stalag 7A near Moosburg. By early 1945, it had swelled to hold more than 80,000 prisoners, Germans, Italians, Russians, and men from nearly every corner of the war. Inside its wire fences, despair had become routine. Hunger gnawed, disease lingered, and the only sound most days was the shuffling of boots in mud. But somewhere inside that barbed maze, a small group of prisoners decided to fight the silence. They scrounged materials from the camp's workshops and trading networks, a piece of wire for a string, a plank for a violin body, a discarded tin for percussion. Sheet music, when found, was copied by hand on scraps of paper. Instruments were tuned by ear, not pitch. And slowly, painfully, they built what they would later call the Moosburg Orchestra. The man who led them was Karl Reiner, once a conductor in Munich. Before the war, he had directed small symphonies and trained young musicians. Now, stripped of rank and freedom, he gathered fellow inmates every evening after roll call. He wasn't a commanding officer anymore, he was something rarer, a reminder of who they once were. At first, the guards laughed. A few even mocked them. But Reiner persisted. Music, he said, was not a privilege. It was survival. It reminded them they were still human. As weeks passed, something changed. The orchestra's sound began to echo across the camp. Men who had forgotten how to smile began to hum along. The guards, curious, stopped to listen. Even some American airmen, prisoners themselves after being shot down, joined in, trading songs of home across language barriers. By March 1945, as Germany's collapse became undeniable, the camp's orchestra grew bolder. They performed makeshift concerts in the yard, playing Bach, Mozart, even folk tunes. No one cared who had written them, German or Allied, sacred or simple, only that the notes cut through the grayness of war. When American forces moved toward Bavaria, rumors spread inside the camp that liberation was near. But with liberation came fear. Fear of retribution, of chaos, of being forgotten. So, on one of those last cold mornings, Reiner decided to lead one final performance. He called it a concert for the end of the war. He gathered his men, tuned their fragile instruments, and began to conduct as if the world itself were listening. When the Americans arrived that day, it was not a camp of soldiers they found, but a camp of musicians, playing to the fading heartbeat of an empire. They weren't playing to win. They were playing to be remembered. The American patrol who first heard the music had no idea what they were walking into. Their orders were simple: clear remaining German positions, secure the area, and report any resistance. But what they encountered inside street. Now they believed only in survival. Yet, among the faces, the Americans noticed something strange. A quiet pride. Music had given these men something no bullet could take: dignity. Captain Holbrook found Reiner, the conductor, sitting beside his broken violin. Through a translator, he asked, "Why play now? Why not just wait for us to come?" Reiner smiled faintly. "Because, Captain," he said, "you came too late for many. But not for this." He gestured toward the courtyard. They needed one last thing to remember themselves by. Over the next days, American and German soldiers shared food, cigarettes, and stories. Some GIs even brought out harmonicas and guitars, joining in impromptu jam sessions with the orchestra. It was an unspoken exchange: music for mercy, melody for bread. But outside the camp, the world was still burning. Allied forces pushed toward Munich, Dachau was about to be liberated, and rumors of atrocities began to surface in horrifying waves. Many American soldiers who had just left those death camps now stood before German POWs, the same uniforms, the same insignia, and found it hard to reconcile compassion with what they'd seen. Tension crept back in. Some soldiers refused to enter the camp altogether. Others whispered, "They don't deserve to play." The orchestra, sensing the shifting mood, grew quiet. Reiner gathered his men once more, uncertain if they would ever perform again. That night, a storm rolled in, thunder echoing across the barracks. Rain leaked through the roofs, soaking sheets and paper music alike. But still, he stood in the center of the courtyard, baton in hand, facing the darkness. A few musicians emerged from their bunks. Then a few more. Violins, clarinets, cellos. Soon, a dozen men stood with him, drenched but unbroken. They played not for an audience, but for the rain, for the night, for those who would never hear them again. By morning, word of the concert in the storm had spread across the camp. Even the American guards stood by the wire in silence. It was said that when the music ended, no one spoke for nearly an hour. In the days that followed, Reiner's orchestra performed twice more. Once, for their own people, a farewell. And once more, at the request of the Americans, for a mixed audience of soldiers and prisoners. The last piece they played was Schubert's Ave Maria. When the final note faded, many men, on both sides, were seen wiping tears. Holbrook later wrote in his journal, "It was the first time I felt the war ending, not because we'd won, but because they remembered how to be human." Yet for every act of grace, the shadow of what lay ahead remained. The camp would soon be disbanded. Prisoners would be relocated, interrogated, sent home or to trial. Some would never be heard from again. And as for Karl Reiner, the man who conducted against despair, his story would vanish into the fog of history. No photograph, no record, only a rumor, that he died on the journey home, violin still in hand. But the Americans who had witnessed that strange, impossible concert would never forget it. In their minds, The sound of war's ending wasn't silence. It was music. The official liberation of Stalag 7A came on April 29, 1945. Tanks rolled through the gates at dawn, crushing the barbed wire beneath their treads. Soldiers cheered, flags were raised, and cameras clicked. For most, it was just another military checkpoint secured, one of hundreds across collapsing Germany. But for those who had heard the music days earlier, it was something else entirely. That morning, the Americans found the camp transformed. The prisoners were lined up, awaiting orders, as the orchestra, or what remained of it, stood silently by their instruments. Karl Reiner, frail and unshaven, wore a coat too large for his frame. He had not slept in 2 nights. The camp commandant, a weary man who had long abandoned Nazi ideology, handed over his pistol to Captain Holbrook and uttered the words every liberator longed to hear: "We surrender." But even surrender was complicated. There were tens of thousands of prisoners inside: German, Russian, French, British, American, and more. The logistics were impossible. Tensions flared as nationalities clashed, old enemies now packed into a single sea of confusion. Food was short, tempers shorter. Holbrook, exhausted, called for order. Then Reiner approached him with a strange request. "Captain," he said softly, "let us play once more. Just once, for all of them." Holbrook hesitated. The camp was chaos. Soldiers were shouting orders, trucks moving in and out, translators trying to mediate 100 different cries for help. But there was something in Reiner's eyes, something beyond exhaustion. He nodded. "Do it." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the orchestra assembled one last time in the yard. Not just Germans now. Among them stood captured Americans, Poles, Italians, even a young Russian violinist whose brother had died in the East. Some instruments were broken, others held together by string and faith. They began to play Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 in A major, the Allegretto. The music started softly, uncertain, like a breath after drowning. Then it grew, layer by layer, a heartbeat rising from ashes. The rhythm was steady, mournful, and resolute. It wasn't a performance for applause. It was a prayer. As the melody filled the camp, every voice fell silent. Guards, medics, and prisoners alike stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by victory or defeat, but by the fragile recognition of shared humanity. Holbrook would later write that at that moment, the lines between enemy and ally blurred until all that remained was sound. When the peace ended, no one moved. Then, slowly, the American soldiers began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder, until it became thunderous. Some Germans smiled weakly. Others simply wept. Reiner turned to the orchestra, nodded once, and lowered his baton. It was the last time he would ever conduct. 2 days later, the camp was emptied. Buses and trucks carried men away, some toward freedom, some toward questioning, others toward a future no one could yet imagine. Reiner was last seen near the transport line, clutching his violin wrapped in a tattered blanket. He thanked the Americans for their kindness and promised he would return to Munich to rebuild the orchestra he once led. But history is cruel to quiet men. No record exists of him arriving there. Some survivors later claimed he collapsed on the road home, malnourished and sick. Others said he reached the ruins of Munich but found nothing. No hall, no instruments, no audience. Only silence. And yet, that single concert at Moosburg survived, not in archives or recordings, but in memory. Veterans of the U.S. 14th Armored Division would speak of it decades later at reunions. Some called it the day the music stopped the war. Others described it as the sound of forgiveness. But perhaps the most haunting account came from Private Harold Dean, one of the youngest in Holbrook's unit. In a letter home, he wrote, "We came to free prisoners but found something freer than any man, music that refused to die. They didn't play for Hitler or for Germany. They played for life itself. And for one moment, I believed we all deserved to be saved." When historians pieced together the story years later, many dismissed it as folklore, an embellished soldier's tale. After all, who could imagine beauty surviving amid such destruction? But for those who were there, no proof was needed. The truth was already inside them, as unforgettable as the final chord that lingered over the Bavarian air that night. It was not the sound of surrender. It was the sound of survival. When the war finally ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the world erupted in celebration. Bells rang, flags flew, soldiers kissed strangers in the streets. But far from the cities and cameras, in the quiet fields of southern Germany, the echoes of another kind of victory lingered, not one with bullets or medals, but with music. The story of the Moosburg Orchestra faded quickly from official reports. The war had left too many wounds to count, too many horrors to process. Historians catalogued the battles, the treaties, the crimes, not the symphonies played behind barbed wire. And yet, among those who had witnessed it, the memory endured like an unrecorded note that refuses to vanish. Captain Holbrook returned home to Iowa later that year. He carried with him a violin string, a small token given to him by Reiner before they parted. 4 years, he kept it in a drawer, unable to explain why he couldn't throw it away. On quiet nights, he'd take it out, run his fingers over the worn metal, and remember the day when enemies laid down their hatred and chose harmony instead. Other soldiers wrote of that day in letters and journals. One described it as, "the only moment I felt we reclaimed our souls." Another said simply, "They were supposed to be our captives, but for that hour, they set us free." When post-war Germany began to rebuild, fragments of the Moosburg Orchestra scattered across the new nation. Some of its former members joined the Munich Philharmonic. Others became teachers, rebuilding the culture that war had tried to erase. One clarinetist, Hans Vogel, would later write a memoir in which he described Reiner as the man who conducted silence into life. But for most, the names vanished. No monuments, no plaques. Just a whispered story passed down through families and veterans, a reminder that, even in the heart of destruction, humanity found a way to play. Decades later, in the early 2000s, a researcher at a Bavarian museum uncovered a set of faded papers labeled Musikgruppe Moosburg. Inside were hand-copied sheets of Bach and Schubert, written on camp stationery. Each page was yellowed, edges torn, notes faintly smudged by rain, perhaps from that stormy night when they played against the thunder. Among them was a final page with handwriting identified as Karl Reiner's. It contained no music, just a single line in German.
Wenn die Welt schweigt, spielt weiter.
When the world is silent, keep playing. No one knows what became of him after that. But perhaps that doesn't matter. Because in the end, Reiner's orchestra achieved what entire armies could not. They made men listen again. The war silenced millions of voices. Yet for a few brief hours in a camp of hunger and defeat, music spoke louder than vengeance, louder than ideology, louder than history itself. And when the last note faded, and the world fell quiet again, the silence that followed remembered everything.